Welcome to Perspectives with Asima Silva. Today we invited back our guest from last week. Wais is here again to talk about Afghanistan, the history of it, the politics, and the recent news that came about releasing funds for Afghanistan, unfreezing them. So Wais, let's just jump into it because we noticed that last week when we talked to you, the time flew. And we weren't able to cover all our topics. So we're just going to jump into it. If you don't mind, can you give us a overview of Afghani politics? And the reason why I'm asking that is living in America, growing up during and after 9/11, we have this image of Afghanis, all Afghanis actually, being anti-American culture. And I just want to understand, I completely understand this is perspectives. So the whole point of this show is to understand other people's perspectives. So one thing I know is that we never got the full story. And I don't think we've given the voice to people to understand that Afghanis are probably diverse and probably have many different ideas and beliefs and philosophy, even for their own government. So I really want to know, what was it like? Can you give us a little bit of a history before we dive into the recent politics?
Sure. Thank you very much, Asma. Yeah, I mean, listen, Afghanistan is it's got a vast history. It's complex, and sort of the geopolitics of that region is very complex. It's been called the graveyard of empires, right? Yeah. The British tried to overtake it, the Russians, obviously. So it's comprised of very proud people. The ethnic diversity is significant. But ultimately, you're talking about a prideful people with a deep culture and roots going back ages. But in a nutshell, I think the image, as you referred to, of Afghans being terrorists, or anytime I tell anyone I'm from Afghanistan or Afghanistan, is the proper way to say it. There's always that sort of stereotype of, oh, he's a terrorist, or that's the first thing you think of, right? And unfortunately, I think that's been sort of etched in a lot of people's minds based on a confluence of events that I guess arose most notably on 9/11. I think people are really are not really in tune with the actual Afghan people. People have to be reminded that 9/11 sort of arose from like I said, a confluence of events. But that really, when the Russians invaded Afghanistan in 1978, 79, there was a lot of assistance behind the scenes by the United States to arm the Mujahideen who were fighting the Soviets, right? Well, guess what? Osama bin Laden was part of the contingent that actually, based on his influences in the Islamic world, and remember, Osama bin Laden Saudi, he actually joined forces with the CIA in helping fight the Soviets. And then Osama bin Laden actually invited, it was basically a call to arms, so to speak, right? So it was the Islamic community under fire, literally and figuratively, from the Soviets. And so Osama had enlisted his network, and Muslims from all over the world came to fight. And so it created that sort of melting pot of Muslims. And obviously once the Soviets were, I guess, defeated, you could say, then it was sort of a safe haven for a lot of those Muslims that stayed behind and had fought in Afghanistan. And so that wasn't really the Afghan people. It was a conglomeration of Muslims from all over. And I think at that point, then, you started to see policies against Muslims in various parts of the world, whether it be in Israel and the Palestinian fight, some places in Africa. Afghanistan was used sort of as a hub for, once the Americans exited, then it left this, I guess, vacuum, but the likes of Osama bin Laden stayed behind, and out of that arose various groups that, I hate to call names of Al Qaeda and the Taliban ultimately, and all these different groups. But I think, even those names of those groups, there's a lot of misinformation about how those groups arose, and who they were backed by, and it's so again, it's very complicated. But ultimately, the Afghan people are left victim because they're sort of in the crosshairs of all this politics and all this poor policies. Let's face it, the United States policies have caused a lot of what we're seeing today, and even most recently, them exiting the way they did, the way we did. And unfortunately, we're now left with a situation in Afghanistan currently with the Taliban there that, we talked a little bit last time about the plight of the refugees here,
Right.
and how they were able to come here, find, quote unquote, a safe haven. However, we overlook also, and that's a whole story in itself, as we know and as we refer to. But we've also now left with a situation in Afghanistan where there's a major humanitarian crisis, lack of food, shortage of various resources, because, as you referred to earlier, our funds were frozen that were allocated and earmarked for the Afghan people at the various central banks. The Afghan central bank had funds in New York that were frozen, and President Biden just announced today that he would unfreeze those funds. However, half of that is earmarked to go to 9/11 families and their victims. And so that is interesting, right? Obviously, we have sympathy for the families, and 100% they should be compensated in some fashion. But you're now blaming Afghanistan, and you're punishing the people of Afghanistan for what happened on 9/11, when I just explained sort of how that all arose. And so now you're depriving the Afghan people that are currently suffering from additional aid to their infrastructure, which is sorely needed. And you're also blaming the Afghan people for what happened on 9/11, which is, to me, what can I say, Asima? It's a shame, and it's just I think it sends the wrong message in many ways. But again, it's politics, and I know that's the way it goes.
So what would you say is the current feelings of the Afghani people towards America? We've obviously in the last 20 years have had a lot of history, a lot of turmoil, a lot of hurt. So what would you say is, the way the refugees may be feeling versus the way the people that are still in Afghanistan are feeling towards our country?
That's a good question. I think there's definitely a lot of resentment in terms of the way the American left Afghanistan in the manner that they did, and sort of in the aftermath of that, you've seen sort of the collateral damage in many ways. And I think it's just sort of almost expected now, and not just in Afghanistan but other countries, that these Western powers and American and policies are usually, I think the perception is that the American government will do as it pleases and whatever is in their best interest. And so Afghanistan is strategically, it's truly an area where there's a reason why, the Russians tried to overtake it, the British. It's rich in natural resources. Strategically, it's positioned in a place where it's definitely vital for some of these countries to have a presence there. But I think, people know that, look, we're being used, and there's a certain element of wanting to destabilize that region. And so you're seeing conflict between Afghanistan, Pakistan, and then India is involved as well. And so sometimes these policies, and I think this is sort of a prevailing thought, to answer your question more specifically, that it's almost in the best interests of the United States, for example, to keep that region destabilized, right? And then it allows for access to that region, and it allows for strategically a lot of benefit to keep that region destabilized. And now, countries like China have opportunity, Russia have opportunity. So but I think overall, the refugees obviously might feel like they have escaped to a better situation, but having been involved in that process with the refugees and seeing it up close firsthand, I can tell you that the resettlement efforts have not gone according to plan, and there's a lot of hurt and pain in the Afghan refugee community, and a lot of them long for what they had in Afghanistan, and so it's a lot. There's a lot of tragedy there, and it's gonna be a long road back to regaining the trust of the American government, and that's why it's so imperative that the appropriate action be taken by the current administration. And today's act by President Biden did not sort of meet our expectations in the Afghan community. And if anything, it creates even more resentment, unfortunately. So
I'm going to ask a question. It's more of a devil's advocate question.
Yeah.
I would like to know, like, the lifestyle of a typical Afghani before 9/11, and maybe what I would consider a typical Afghani for the current situation now. And the reason why I'm asking that is the images that at least I saw growing up of Afghanistan was like mountainous, nomadic, uncultured, uneducated, backwards type of situation. And then when I talk to Afghani people, I hear, no, it was a very metropolitan, diverse, type of situation. So I'm wondering, when you say, the situation in Afghanistan has deteriorated, what does that mean? Because the images we saw, and when you say the word deteriorated, I'm really not seeing how much more deterioration could there have been, right? So just to answer the questions that people have in their mind and their images that they have in their mind of Afghanistan, because there are people out there who believe that the refugees should be grateful that they are in a first world country, right? Because of the images that they have seen of Afghanistan compared to what they're getting here. Some people do feel that these people should just be grateful. And, I think they don't understand what you're saying. It doesn't register, or it's not comprehensible or imaginable of, you're saying they're longing to what they had. So what did they have? And what are they missing when they come here?
Well, I mean, your country is your country, right? And but pre-Taliban, what did the Americans do for the last 20 years? Their military presence. They were building towards something, right? And they felt like they left it at a point where they can actually leave. So you were seeing women becoming lawyers and doctors. And I run a school with my family. I run a orphanage, school for orphans in Afghanistan, the Homaira Rahman Foundation. But we were keen on helping Afghan women become educated and going through the school system as any normal child should have the right to. And so the last few years, since the ousting of Taliban 1.0, there were a lot more opportunities, and Afghanistan was flourishing. If you look at the 1970s in Afghanistan, probably one of the most prosperous periods, where it was a cosmopolitan city, and it was very modern. It was definitely even a vacation destination for a lot of people in the surrounding countries. If you even saw the attire back then, you would see women in skirts, right? Which is a far cry from what you would see now in Afghanistan under the Taliban, right? Yeah. So it was a very progressive Muslim country, and until the Russians came in, again, everything changed, right? And then sort of explain the history and sort of what's transpired since. And so what they had before this Taliban 2.0 and what the refugees have today is you had a country that was starting to build itself slowly but surely. Yes, the Americans invested hundreds of millions and billions of dollars into the country, but again, it wasn't managed properly, right? Funds earmarked for restoration, for infrastructure. There was a lot of corruption with that regime, the Karzai regime, the Ghani regime. And that's, again, oversight. Like, how do you not have oversight over the funds that you're allocating? How do you not audit the funds that are earmarked for the people in the infrastructure? And this is just mismanagement. It's poor leadership. And unfortunately, so to answer your question, I think we were building towards a more modern Afghanistan, a more progressive Afghanistan. Again, lawyers, doctors, women were having opportunities, but they were also living under the constant threat. Is there going to be an explosion here? Is there going to be, because there's still that sort of, there's still those external influences with the Taliban and those other groups, and then how the different factions in Afghanistan with the different warlords existed. So there's still an element of a destabilized Afghanistan. But in places like Kabul, where there was more reinforcement for the American military, they were allowed to progress to a degree. So, but listen, now the refugees here, you're still talking about them being in these different ports, right, across the country, and essentially they're prisons. Not literally, but you're dependent on various programs to help in the resettlement of these Afghans, and the local communities just don't have the budgets to carry that out in a fashion that would meet the expectations of any ordinary citizen, let alone a refugee, right? So that calls for the federal government to get involved and pour more into those efforts to resettle the Afghans appropriately, so that the communities can handle a subset of refugees in their schools, in their in the homes around those areas, and it's otherwise, what future is it for those Afghans? Can they find a job? What is their immigration status going to be? Right. I mean, there's all these questions that it was done so haphazardly that the planning for it wasn't really done concurrently, and so you're left with a very poor situation right now, in a dire situation. I hate to paint that bleak picture, but that's reality. And it impacts our communities here in the United States and wherever the Afghans are resettling. So it does have impact to everyone, really, in the U.S. as well. And so.
So after 9/11, obviously, United States went in and, tried to get into that country for military reasons and whatnot. So what is and you're just saying that you run an orphanage and educate orphans. So how many orphans, what was the casualties that Afghanistan felt? Because we don't hear that side of the story. At least I did not receive as much reports from that side. What was the casualties that Afghanistan actually encountered?
You mean before 9/11?
I mean, like after 9/11 with the
whole, after 9/11, yeah.
Because I feel, I want to understand the reason of why, the United States felt that we do have to take in refugees. We do have to now kind of stabilize the Afghani people and help them out. And we didn't hear a lot of information.
Yeah, I mean,
about the casualties, about why should we be helping, right? Because our country was hurting so much, we focused on our casualties. And I'm asking, what casualties and suffering did Afghanistan face as consequences of 9/11?
Yeah, I mean, whenever 9/11 happens and your country is sort of the focus of what actually happened here in the United States, and whenever there is misinformation on what actually happened, clearly, under that Taliban 1.0 regime, and when after the Soviets were defeated, and as I mentioned, there was a lot of infighting within there's also these different factions in the Afghan space, but ultimately there was just a lot of collateral damage done with the Americans after they came in, and then the Taliban taking over, and there was just a lot of it was truly a destabilized area, and the damage to the people was significant. And as far as the orphans situation, yeah, I mean, a lot of the people were lost in battle over the years, and it's just like, unfortunately, any story of where a war-torn nation left in tatters, so to speak, and unfortunately the children suffer. They lose their fathers and they lose their mothers, and it's sort of the history of our last few decades, and so we were just at the point before what just happened a few months ago of trying to regain the foothold that we had at one point in the 60s and 70s, where Afghanistan was sort of flourishing. And so we were hopeful. It was still not ideal in terms of the dynamics of our political leaders and sort of still some of the policies that were being made, but there was hope, at least. And so, it's one of those things where you try to stay optimistic, but then you realize, if you look at history, that it seems like there's some concerted effort to truly destabilize that region, like as I mentioned earlier, for the benefit of the superpowers, and it serves their purpose when that area is destabilized. And there's a very complex geopolitics around that, but that's another show.
Well, we only have a few minutes, but if did you want to expand on that? I'm a little curious on how you believe that going forward, how would it be more destabilized? Who are the players, and what do you think is going to be happening?
Well, I mean, you're seeing right now, a very interesting situation where the Pakistanis, for example, are being blamed in a lot of circles for the rise of the Taliban, right? Because there is, to a degree, support from the Pakistani intelligence group, the ISI, for the Taliban, and so when you see any interviews with any Taliban, they're all speaking Pashto, and they're influenced because they were raised in that region through the madrasas, and so now the United States, on the other hand, supports the Pakistani military at the same time, right? So there's a little bit of a conflict of interest there if you're looking to take certain action against the Taliban, but yet you're supporting the Pakistani military and the ISI at the same time. Then on top of that, you have the relationship with India. And so then you have the Pakistan-India sort of relationship. And so you're almost we're all like pawns, these countries. And I believe the United States sort of picks and chooses how it works each relationship for its benefit. And unfortunately, what occurs is what you're seeing now, which is that sort of destabilization, and it's very complex. It's more than meets the eye, and I think also there's a lot of facts that we are not made aware of in terms of what's really going on behind the scenes. And I wish I had all the answers. All I can say is
China a player?
China's certainly a player. I think with what's currently going on, they have an opportunity here, and I think you're seeing now them trying to build relations with the Taliban, which is interesting also, because you have the situation with the Uyghurs, as far as being Muslim, and their views on Islam in China, and now you're partnering with the Taliban, who are an extreme version of Islam, if you want to call it that. So, what is the dynamic there? And well, because they know that they want to actually try to stabilize that region for their own benefit. Otherwise, it's going to be a headache for China as well. And yes, there are natural resources in Afghanistan, so let's partner with the Taliban to get them, in a situation where they can actually coexist. So there's just a lot of moving parts. It's not as it seems on the surface, and in the end, it's a lot of questions. I think there are a lot of questions that we'll never know the answers to, as to why certain things are happening. And all I know is through experience, through talking to Afghan communities, political insiders, the prevailing thought is that a destabilized region benefits, and benefits the Western powers. And through history, there's a pattern of that right across the world, and whether it's the United Kingdom with its empires in all parts of the world, the United States, and so it gives you a foothold in those areas, in those parts of the world, and ultimately, there's intent behind a lot of what you see with policy that is, unfortunately, the news doesn't exactly. It's controversial, right? Even for me to say that.
Right.
But I'm just sort of talking about the reality, and certainly the country itself, the people. There's no. I love, I've lived here. I've had opportunities here, so it's really not that. It's just sort of policies, right? It's in any power, whether it's Russia or China or, there's all kinds of controversial. In Ukraine, you're seeing it now. It's just the way it is. It's an ugly world out there, and so my philosophy is try to do the best you can to impact those around you, and whether it's us working through for our foundation with the orphans, or doing the little we can to raise awareness on what's going on, to unfreeze the funds that we've been doing through the Human Rights Watch campaign.
So we have about 10 seconds left. Would you mind sharing us information about that foundation if people do want to look it up? And
thank you. Yeah, hrfcares.org, hrfcares.org, Homaira Rahman Foundation. We partner with the children. That is TCAL. That's another organization that's done some great work with schools. And so, please check out what we're doing, and hopefully you can contribute to the betterment of our country and the children ultimately.
So thank you for joining us again, and I'd like to wrap up. Thank you again for joining us and listening. And of course, we're all about perspectives. Understanding our history helps us understand our future and the people that we're going to be dealing with in the communities that we live in. So join us again for Perspectives with Asima Silva.